Thanks for coming out tonight. We have a great program. We had the privilege of seeing Sean Carroll give a technical seminar just a couple of hours ago, and it was amazing. And he says this one's even more amazinger. I would encourage everybody to check your cell phones, make sure the vibration's on and the sounds are off. And I'm so pleased to see such a huge crowd tonight. I felt like it would be sort of anti-patriotic for me to encourage people to skip the town hall debates and come here. So I didn't say that, but I'm glad to see that all of you guys are literate, that you know you can read about the town hall debates in the newspaper tomorrow, go approach the candidates directly and shake their hands. And here tonight we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to hear Dr. Carroll. Before he speaks to us, we're going to have Nancy Solomon give us a few words, and then I will present some awards, and then we will introduce Dr. Carroll.
Can you hear me?
No.
Really? Really no? A little bit?
Hold it close.
Really close? Then I've got to put this. Okay, is that close enough? That amount?
That's good.
Okay, so welcome everybody. This is a great crowd, tremendous, I'd say, tremendous. I'm Nancy Solomon, a professor in the Department of Biology, as well as a longtime member of the Hefner Advisory Committee. And more recently, I've become the chair of the committee, so I've got the pleasure of introducing people who will introduce people who will introduce people. You only thought you'd hear Sean Carroll talk tonight. So I am really happy to welcome you all here tonight for the 43rd annual Hefner Lecture. So we've got a lot of co-sponsors tonight, and let me just take a minute to thank them all for their generosity. The Audubon, Miami Valley, Miami University Departments of Biology, Geology, and Environmental Earth Science, Microbiology, Miami University Regional Biological Sciences Department, Kinesiology and Health, the Graduate School and Institute for Environment and Sustainability, Special Events Fund, and the University Honors Program, to name just a few. So tonight, we recognize and honor the contribution of Dr. Robert Hefner, Doc Hefner as he was known. He was instrumental in establishing the Hefner Museum of Natural History, but what I never realized until a few years ago is that he was also involved in the establishment of Houston Woods State Park and the Silver Nature Sanctuary. So any of you that have ever been there could really appreciate his contributions. So they're just fabulous places, nice natural areas in scenic southwestern Ohio. See, he also served Miami University for 60 years, from 1925 to 1985 as professor, department chair, and museum director. How about that for record of service? I'm sure all of us plan to stay around that long too. So this legacy of service is also perpetuated throughout the Hefner family. A number of them have traveled the length of the state, pretty much, or almost the length of the state, to be here tonight. And Megan, who's Dr. Robert Hefner's great-granddaughter, right, has traveled the furthest. She says she came either upstairs or downstairs, depending on where she was in this building. She's a third-year engineering student here at Miami. All stand so we can recognize the contributions that your family has made. So from Oberlin and Bay Village, west side of Cleveland, Ohio, let's welcome I want to welcome another special guest. Miami University's First Lady, Dr. Renata Crawford, is with us this evening, and we're happy to see you again this year. So thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to help us celebrate over 4 decades of Hefner lectures here tonight. So I think tonight's lecture will sure to become one of the most memorable in a long line of fascinating lectures. Now I'd like to introduce you to the director of the Hefner Museum of Natural History, Stephen Sullivan. He is just the 5th director of the facility in more than its 60-year history. And then, after the seminar tonight, I'm inviting you to join us in Dr. Carroll's honor. At the Hefner Museum of Natural History, 100 Upham Hall, close by. There'll be some refreshments, great conversation. Dr. Carroll, I imagine, will be happy to sign books or posters for us. So there was, his latest book has been for sale out there, and I think there'll be some copies at the museum. I've already started reading it, and it's really as interesting as some of his earlier ones. I highly recommend it. The last thing I want to say is that we've got a new Miami tradition. That almost sounds like an oxymoron for those of us that have been here at Miami for a while. So it's called Stump Steve. So try to stump him with some of your nature-related questions. By the end of your time talking to him, I bet you'll be making connections with the natural world, and will have things to remember, share with your friends and family. So we hope you'll join us for the reception after the talk tonight. At this time, I'd like to ask Steve Sullivan to recognize some other special guests.
Well, thank you, Nancy. And Stump Steve is just an invitation to discuss. It's not a challenge. I'm sure you can stump me. This is really, to me, this is an anniversary. I've been here now 1 full cycle of events. I've basically been here a year. And during the time that I've been here, I've received such strong support from Tom Chris and Chris Makaroff, and both Greg and Renata Crawford. And they've all helped make my time here, my transition here, successful. And in fact, many of the more expensive changes that you've seen we've done to the museum, they've helped facilitate. And I've found a lot of strengths here at Miami University as I've begun to get to know all of you. The museum is so lucky to have friends like you. Basically, all of the outreach, all of the exhibitry, all of the wonderful things that we get to do with students are funded through grants and private donations that come primarily from folks like you. And all of these things that we do at the museum are student-driven. After the talk, I hope you'll take Nancy up on the invitation to go to the reception, get some great food. Julie's made a great selection on the menu, but also go through the museum and look at things. You'll see signs that show upcoming exhibits and exhibit opportunities. The museum is a hub for students of all majors. Currently, we're working with students from over 16 majors. We're working with 4 capstone projects, and as you'll see over there, we've got another 30 or 40 projects that are in the works. We just have to find the time, money, and people to get it done. And this is all thanks to everything that you guys do for the museum, so I really appreciate that. I also have the privilege tonight of presenting the Distinguished Service Awards, and it's been a tradition at the museum to pick out one person amongst the hundreds that are serving the museum for particular recognition, and of course this can be very difficult. Thankfully this year it was a little bit easier because the recipients of this year's award approached the natural history collections here at Miami University with a vision and a dedication that really hadn't been done since 1809. They established a place for the museum within the university and within the community. These people are really responsible for the foundation of any success that I will have here because of what they created with the museum, what they turned this space in Upham Hall into. And so I would like to invite Don Kaufman and Cecilia Bird to join me on the stage. it seems like almost too little to just say thanks for the plaque, because the service that these two have given to the museum is really immeasurable. And just thanks so much for everything you guys have done. So now I'd like to have Dave Byrne come up and he will introduce our speaker for the evening.
I wasn't going to wear these, I used to make a bigger font, but now I'm wearing it. In 1974, the medical researcher and poet Lewis Thomas published a collection of essays entitled The Lies of the Cell, Notes of a Biology Watcher. In the essay, An Earnest Proposal, Thomas issues a challenge that science should attempt to completely understand a single form of life. The organism he suggested as a subject of this challenge is the protozoan Mixotricha paradoxa. This single-celled organism lives in the gut of Australian termites, where it spends its time digesting cellulose from the wood that termites eat, leaving only lignin, which passes through the termites. Termites use these lignin pellets to build their nests, which house not only termites but many other organisms as well. Thus, little Mixotricha paradoxa is a key player in the miniature ecosystems that are termite mounds. However, upon further examination, it turns out that Mixotricha paradoxa is itself a collection of organisms. The protozoan is propelled by long, slender bacteria that are attached to it. Other bacteria live on the surface of the cell. And in place of mitochondria, Mixotricha contains spherical bacteria that are the powerhouses of the host cell. In his essay, Thomas suggests that it might take 10 years to understand this single form of life. Fast forward more than 4 decades after the issuance of Thomas's challenge, we find that science still seeks to understand a single form of life. Further, we are faced with problems little known or appreciated in 1974. The growing human domination of ecosystems, the collapse of marine fisheries, and the myriad consequences of rapid changes in the world's climates. Our challenge now is not only to understand a single form of life, but to understand how all forms of life interact to maintain life on Earth. Tonight we are joined by Dr. Sean B. Carroll, a scientist who has spent his career trying to discover the relationships among organisms and the mechanisms that maintain biodiversity. After completing degrees at Washington University in St. Louis and Tufts University, Sean joined the faculty of the University of Wisconsin, where he is the Alan Wilson Professor of Molecular Biology, Genetics, and Medical Genetics. He is an evolutionary biologist whose research has been at the forefront of the emerging field of evolutionary developmental biology, also known as Evo-Devo. As a result of this career studying the genes that control body patterns and their role in the evolution of animal diversity, Sean has received the Benjamin Franklin Medal of Sciences in Life Sciences, has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, and to the American Philosophical Society. He is one of the preeminent research biologists of our time. But wait, there's more. Sean is also the Vice President for Science Education at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. In this capacity, Sean demonstrates his passion for science communication. These efforts have resulted in the publication of 7 books for popular audiences, including Remarkable Creatures, Epic Adventures in the Search for the Origins of Species, which was a finalist for the 2009 National Book Award. The many awards he has received for science education and communication include the Stephen Jay Gould Prize for Advancing Public Understanding of Evolution and the Distinguished Service Award from the National Association of Biology Teachers. He has received honorary doctorates from Tufts University and the University of Minnesota. This past year, Sean won the Lewis Thomas Prize from Rockefeller University. This literary prize recognizes those who write about the intersection of science and humanities. Other winners have included Ernst Mayr, E.O. Wilson, and just this year, Sylvia Earle. As the saying goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. When Lewis Thomas was writing his essay, he was very concerned with the threat posed by the Cold War and the nuclear weapons that could destroy the world. His earnest proposal was that the world's leaders agreed to wait until we knew everything about one form of life before calculating, I quote, acceptable levels of megadeath. He proposed that in 10 years, the conclusion would be that we needed to learn even more about Mixotricha paradoxa, and thus more delays in this awful calculation. Tonight, Sean Carroll tells us about the Serengeti rules, the quest to discover how life works and why it matters. We will learn about systems larger and more complex than the fascinating Mixotricha paradoxa. In these days of ballistic missile tests and world leaders who casually discuss nuclear war, let us hope that Sean's work inspires us to extend Lewis Thomas's earnest proposal. Let us wait until we know everything about all of life before we engage in calculating acceptable levels of megadeath. Please join me in welcoming Sean B. Carroll as he shares with us the rules that ensure that life continues on planet Earth.
Thank you, Dave, for that extraordinary introduction and context. I know, I want to make sure volume's okay. How are we doing in the back rows? I got thumbs up, I think. How about on the right side? No thumbs came up over there. Different finger. So, thanks so much for all the hospitality all day here at Miami. It's an extraordinary place. I should also mention I'm a native Ohioan. First trip here to Miami. I grew up in Toledo, born and raised. So it's really nice to see another part of the MAC conference. And I also want to thank all of you for coming out tonight and trusting, and might be a little more than an hour of your night. Before I get going, I want to actually say something maybe in the context of Dave's comments to the younger members of the audience, which is, I know you got a lot of competing demands in your time, and as this gets a little later and maybe towards the 8:40 mark, you might need to get somewhere. I hate to reserve it for the end, but I really hope that one of my major messages tonight is one of hope. And it's not one made out of thin air, it's one grounded in a story that I'm going to tell you by the time we get to the end. So that's just a little carrot if you can make it that far. Okay. And my tales tonight are begin on the Serengeti, and we're going to get there in a minute, but I want to give you some context. Okay. In 2014, I was just wrapping up work on a film for the Smithsonian Channel on the rosy subject of mass extinction. And what we did in that film was we looked back in the past at a couple mass extinctions and the phenomena that led to erasure of the majority of species on the planet, and held that up as a yardstick to some things going on today. And that was the first time I had sort of traveled around a bit with ecologists. I'm an indoor molecular biologist and didn't have close relationships with ecologists, but they started showing me that even some of the most protected places on the planet are showing some serious issues. And like you, I've seen headlines like these of the disappearance of half of the world's animals just in the last 45 years or so. And what strikes me is this is sort of, while I was aspiring to and becoming a biologist, this is just an unacceptable thing to be happening on our watch. And I read headlines like this about the prospects of a highway being built right through the middle of the Serengeti in East Africa, right through the migration route of wildebeest. And it's these sort of headlines and even the concern of professional ecologists that I was hearing that made me worry. I've been spending so much time in the lab, I hadn't seen some of these places. And so I thought, really, in my heart, a little bit, maybe before it's too late, or at least let's see how things are doing. I wanted to see the Serengeti, and I also wanted my family to see the Serengeti. So that summer, 6 of us, 3 of my sons, my daughter-in-law, and my wife, they're in the center, Jamie and Blue, we loaded up for, and I have a pointer that went somewhere. Probably won't need it. Excuse me, just talk amongst yourselves. Got a lot of gear on at the moment. Okay. We wanted to see the Serengeti for ourselves. So there were 6 of us in a vehicle. And so there we are outside the extremely fancy entrance gate, eastern entrance gate of the Serengeti. And we're going to load up in the vehicle. I'll give you a view right over the roof of the vehicle. This is late June 2014. We're going to head into the Serengeti. As you can see, it's already starting to dry out a little bit. There's brown grass. And top is popped up, and the anticipation is rising in the vehicle, and we start heading in. And we're scanning left and right, left and right. And the grass is kind of high, and I'm the only biologist in the family, so I'm starting to worry a little bit. Somebody does call out, and you can see the back of this lioness poking up from the grass, but I'm still thinking, well, that's exciting, but if this is what it's going to be like, you know, they're gonna toss me out of the vehicle, turn around, and drive away. This is just too hard. But we kept driving, and we started to see little flecks of green appear on the horizon, and came up over a rise, and this is what we saw. "360 degrees around, all we saw were stripes." These are home movies, by the way. I know, like, the worst thing you should ever do to any stranger, but yeah, all home movies. Probably 2,000 zebra around, and then coming down from the west, the Dawn Patrol. And from that moment on, the Serengeti offered up an unending canvas of animals of all sizes, shapes, and colors, from sort of the sturdy warthog to lounging hippos to sleek impala to majestic giraffe, and need I say more? This lovely spent a private morning with us as she dined on a gazelle she stuffed up in a tree. So like everyone else who's ever been there, I was awestruck. No matter what I had seen on television, no matter what I had read, I was not prepared for what I had seen, both in terms of the sheer numbers of animals and of that landscape. Just amazing. But as the days went by, especially as some of my family asked Dad, the biologist, some questions, a little unease sort of came over to me. I didn't understand what I was looking at. Nothing about it. I didn't understand, for example, why were there so many wildebeest, but comparatively few topi, a grazer of about the same size. I'm a professional biologist. I've been in this game a good number of years. No clue how this pageant in front of me is working. And that's embarrassing because I've spent my entire professional career studying the making and evolution of the animal kingdom. In fact, how stripes and spots are made on animals. Now, granted, a little more or less charismatic animals than, zebras and leopards, but nonetheless, I'm looking at a scene that is incomprehensible to me. Now, what I do know from studying the making and evolution of animals is that these events that I could see into with, for example, all sorts of fancy colored molecular probes and things like that, is that in animal bodies and in our bodies, everything, the number of everything, is regulated. What I mean by that is that every substance in our bodies, every fat, every salt, every hormone, as you know, insulin, estrogen, whatever it is, these are maintained in a particular range. And when they are outside of those ranges, we feel it. We call that disease and want to do something about it. And similarly, in our bodies, every cell type, whether that's red cells or white cells or skin cells, gut cells, etc., are also maintained in particular numbers. So if the numbers of most every molecule and the numbers of most every cell type are maintained, this is suggesting that a lot of life is regulated. And in fact, molecular biologists, my tribe of biologists, over the last 50 years, have really dedicated to understanding the rules of regulation in our bodies. And to understand those rules of regulation, to understand how life works, there's really been a common strategy. And that strategy has been to identify, allow me, especially in Ohio, a sports analogy. Okay, you all right with that? Go Buckeyes. No? Go Buckeyes? Come on, we're that part of Ohio.
Red
aren't we? I know, okay, Miami.
Go Badgers.
All right, I'll go with Go Badgers too. We identify the key players. In this case, these are molecules that regulate a process. And we figure out the rules that govern their play. And this is what's been going on for the last 50 or 60 years. And it's no exaggeration to say that this has sparked a revolution in medicine. Most of the Nobel Prizes for the last 50 or 60 years have been awarded to those people who have identified the key players or figured out the rules that govern their play. Most of the most impactful drugs that have been developed over the last 50 years have really two strategies to them. Either they restore missing players or they fix broken links in the body. Those missing players that might be familiar to you, for example, insulin in the case of diabetes. We have genetically engineered human insulin, which is to restore levels of insulin when we can no longer make the proper levels. Or, for example, things like statins, which have revolutionized the management of heart disease, essentially fix broken links in the regulation of cholesterol metabolism in the body. So it's no exaggeration to say that understanding how life works at this level has had dramatic impacts on human health. But the question I was confronted in the Serengeti was, okay, if life is regulated at that scale, are there rules that regulate the numbers of things that I see in front of me? What about the numbers of animals and plants? And it turns out, yes, there are these rules, and for convenience, they happen to all be on display in the Serengeti, if you know how to look for them. And that's really the foundation of the recent book that I just wrote. And I called these the Serengeti rules for that reason, because they operate everywhere across the globe. You see them in the Serengeti, but they operate everywhere across the globe. And not only do they govern life at larger scales, but most importantly, to certainly the last part of my talk, I'll put it rhetorically, can we use them to preserve or even cure alien ecosystems in sort of the same way that we use the knowledge of the rules of regulation at a deeper scale to cure or help ailing human health? So that's where we're headed tonight. But before I get there, I want to give you a little history about the Serengeti that I thought you might find interesting. Now, the Serengeti was not a well-known place for most of the first half of the 20th century. The world was kind of preoccupied with a couple of world wars. Very few tourists visited. It was hard to get to. Tsetse fly levels were tough, etc. It wasn't until after World War II in the 1950s that people started visiting, and those first people were largely biologists. And biologists, confronted with what I saw, which were large numbers of animals, did what biologists do, which is they decided we better count these things, okay? So the first question is, what's all here? So how did they count? Well, I want to show you how they did their work. I'm going to show you a clip from a documentary film made in 1959, where Bernard and Michael Gibbet, two German zoologists, take the first count of the Serengeti in their very nattily decorated plane. All right? And I want to show you how they did this. They've got a pilot, a couple other spotters, clipboards, and okay, here we go. You going to help? Ready? Now, on this is graphics circa 1959 Hollywood. Here's their strategy for going across the Serengeti in a grid. And here we go, counting wildebeest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is how they did it. Flying low and slow, 120 miles an hour, as low as 100 feet or less over the animal herds with clipboards, back and forth, day after day in January 1958. Counting everything that was large enough to count. All right? So there you see them counting on their clipboard. They don't seem to be making as many checks as there seem to be animals out there. All right. So this is the first aerial survey of Serengeti. And they published this survey in a book, but it was also made in this movie called Serengeti Shall Not Die, which, footnote, won the Oscar for documentary in 1959. All right, so what did the Gibbets come up with in their survey in January 1958? They came up with 99,481 wildebeest. Not 482 and not 480, all right? And with similar Teutonic precision. 57,199 zebra, 5,172 topi, 1,800 or so buffalo, 60 elephants. Over 366,000 large mammals in total. They were awestruck, but they were worried. They'd never seen the numbers like this before. And they asked in their book, were there enough plains, mountains, river valleys, and bush areas to maintain the last giant herds still in existence? Now, as it turns out, an answer to their question was forthcoming, but it wasn't the answer they expected or feared. And that answer started to emerge when a young Oxford undergraduate named Tony Sinclair arrived in the Serengeti in 1965. Now, Tony came to study birds, but he was immediately hurled into the aerial survey process, which was then being repeated every couple of years. And in the course of that aerial survey, a little mystery popped up. And that mystery was there appeared to be an increase in the number of buffalo in the Serengeti. from 16,000 in 1961 to 37,000 in 1965. Now, Tony was smitten with what he saw in the Serengeti, and he really wanted to do his PhD, come back and do his PhD work in the Serengeti. And they said, well, can a birdman study buffalo? And Tony says, I'll study anything. True story. And so Tony comes back to study this buffalo history. Now, yeah, granted, it wasn't just the buffalo that he was interested in. He realized he had to study something to sort of get a hold of the Serengeti and start to figure out what was going on. But over the next dozen years or so, what Tony really wanted to ask was, first, why were the buffalo increasing, if they were? What explained the great differences in the numbers of different kinds of animals? This was the stunning part of the Serengeti spectacle. And really, in his soul, what he wanted to understand was, why is the Serengeti the way it is? So he started with the buffalo mystery, and the first thing he wanted to verify was that, in fact, the number of buffalo was increasing. So he continued to count them in subsequent years, and in fact, it was growing. They increased from 54 to 58,000. So almost a fourfold increase. I'm sorry, I am belting it out because I know this. Maybe not loud enough back here. So if my voice grows, don't worry about it. About a fourfold increase over this period of time. And he thought, well, this is a mystery. Why is the number of buffalo increasing? Now, this is one part, this is the audience participation part of the program tonight. You are all now in the Serengeti, and I would like you to come up and shout out some hypotheses of why might the number of buffalo be increasing. Go ahead, anything.
Miscount.
Miscount? I love the optimists. I didn't, two things.
Population density?
What's that?
High population density?
Well, they're reaching high population density over the area they're counting, right? So the number's up. So why would there be more buffalo than there were before?
Lions are being killed.
Lions are being killed. So he's saying fewer predators? Can I translate that? Say it again.
Good condition for growing.
Good conditions for growing, meaning of growing buffalo, like more food.
Yes.
Notice I slipped that one in there. Okay. So we got maybe a miscount, fewer predators, more food. Anybody want to throw anything else out?
They were hiding.
They were hiding. It's kind of in the miscount category, but a little more lyrical. And I heard disease. Okay. So Tony had to evaluate these hypotheses, and his first thing he wanted to see was, well, maybe, is there more food? Right? Are somehow the conditions on the Serengeti different? Well, they've been surveying the Serengeti every year. In fact, they could survey the amount of forage in the grasslands, and in fact, no change. The amount of food available to the buffalo was the same. Now, you might say, maybe there are fewer predators, maybe the lions are being killed off. So he had to evaluate this after eliminating food as a possibility. Are there fewer predators? Well, two observations. First of all, the number of predators was actually going up. So the number of lions was increasing. He does not like that observation, but that's all right. You're going to like the answer eventually. The second thing is Tony made a careful study of what buffalo actually died of, and it turns out that most of them didn't die from predation as it was. Okay? So that led to what else could be going on. We heard it over here. Why else would buffalo die? If they're not starving, if they're not being eaten by predators, what would be reducing the mortality of buffalo? Well, perhaps disease. And Tony did know about a disease that was actually notorious in the Serengeti. For about 70 years, periodically the Serengeti was hit with a disease called rinderpest, or cattle plague. It also hit the cattle herds of the nomadic tribes, of the Maasai and other herders around the Serengeti. It arrived in East Africa in the late 19th century. It hit 3 species: domestic cattle, buffalo, and wildebeest. And as you can see from the picture, it was horrific. It was thought that the wildlife were the reservoir, that the virus was jumping into the cattle herds from wildebeest and buffalo. And right around 1960, a vaccine was developed for rinderpest, and the herds, the domesticated herds of cattle, were being vaccinated. So Tony wanted to know, maybe that vaccination was having some spillover benefit to the buffalo. So to check that out, he knew that just like you and I, when buffalo are exposed to a virus, they make antibodies to that virus which are detectable in their blood. So he gathered blood samples from buffalo and matched them with their ages and wanted to see whether or not maybe the exposure to the virus was changing in the buffalo population. And here's that curve. He saw that older buffalo, prior to 1964, had a high exposure rate to the rinderpest virus. But buffalo born after 1964 virtually had no detectable exposure to rinderpest. This is his first eureka moment. So he's thinking, all right, the vaccination, maybe making rinderpest disappear. Now, instead of dying from this virus, the buffalo are booming. Is he right? Well, he knows there's one other wildlife species affected by this virus, and that's the wildebeest. So he starts paying close attention to the wildebeest, and he continues counting wildebeest in subsequent years. So here's what he saw about wildebeest numbers going into the 1970s. Whoa. I love a biology audience. Could you hear the woes? 1.4 million wildebeest by 1977. Look at them grow. Remember, the gimmicks were worried that there wasn't enough food and space for 360,000 large mammals. There's 1.4 million wildebeest in the Serengeti. Huge population. Now, Tony has to check, is his hypothesis valid? So he does the same study in the wildebeest, gets their blood samples, looks for exposure to the rinderpest virus, sees the same pattern for the wildebeest. In fact, he can't detect any exposure to the virus in wildebeest born after 1963. So the disappearance of the rinderpest from the Serengeti is releasing these populations of big grazers, buffalo and wildebeest. It also is overturning that bias that the wildlife was the source of the virus, because only the cattle are being vaccinated. Turns out the cattle were the reservoir of the virus, and the virus was spilling out into the wildlife. And that by vaccinating the cattle, he prevented the whole situation. Now, over this time period, Tony's in the Serengeti year after year with some other colleagues, and they're noticing some other changes taking place in the Serengeti. I want to mention 3 of them, and then we're going to connect the dots, okay? First is, every year the Serengeti burns. But what they noticed by measuring the amount of the park area burned, or wildlife area burned in each year, that the fires were becoming fewer and less intense. Here's the actual data. So wherever they looked in the park, there was less of the park was burning, and the fires were less intense. Okay? Fewer and less intense fires. Secondly, they noticed more giraffes. Who doesn't like more giraffes, right? Remember giraffes going up. Third of all, they sort of detected this trend early, but they confirmed it later. Here's a picture from the same place in the Serengeti, looking out over a plain from a vista. And look at the density of trees. So in the foreground in 1980, unfortunately on a cloudy day, trees are a little bit sparse, but they're seeing the number of saplings are increased. So that by 86, it's filling in, by 91 even more, and by a couple decades later, it's a nice little location for us. Fewer, less intense fires, more giraffes, more trees. Shall we connect the dots? Here's the dots he connects. You eliminate this virus, you got more grazers. You got more grazers. What do grazers do? What do they eat? Grass, right. What does grass do at the end of the dry season? Burn. Okay, so when they mow that grass down, and without wildebeest, the grass gets to about 30 centimeters high. But with the wildebeest, they mow it to about 10 centimeters. So you now have less and shorter grass, which is, of course, less fuel for fire. So now you have fewer and less intense fires. Well, what effect does the fire have on the ecosystem, say, let's say, young trees? Right. Less fire, more trees. More trees, what happens? More giraffes. More food for giraffe. In fact, more cover for predators, more nesting sites for birds, more. In fact, out on the plains with the grass mowed down to about 10 centimeters, it's better habitat for butterflies. More wildebeest also meant more poop, which means more dung beetles, more species of dung beetles. The Serengeti is roaring by the late 1970s. These fires have disappeared. So, if you ask Tony, and this is the moment I never saw in any of the wildlife films I ever saw in Africa. Show me, by show of hands, how many films have you seen in the first 90 seconds about anywhere in Africa, and you see a cat take down a gazelle or a zebra, right? Every darn time, okay? But if you ask Tony Sinclair, who's now spent 51 years in the Serengeti, what makes the Serengeti the way it is? The answer is a million long. It's these humble-looking, somewhat, some might say homely creatures okay, just munching grass, but of course they move in a 600-mile circuit around the Serengeti. And that act of mowing the grass down sculpts the landscape for all these other creatures, reducing the fire regime, allowing the trees to grow, creating habitat, creating better grazing for other animals that follow it, like gazelles, and all the knock-on effects that I'm telling you. In fact, to me, the wildebeest is so overlooked. Not this picture, but most of the pictures I'm showing you of animals come from that same family safari and all the video, that I then, to do this lecture, asked my family for pictures of wildebeest, and they had none. Okay? Everybody's looking for something else. So the most common animal that's staring at, and that makes the whole Serengeti go, tourists don't pay attention to it. They all want the driver to go find the cats, right? This is what makes the Serengeti go. And that leads me to my first Serengeti rule. There are 4 tonight. They're going to come a little faster than that first one. And that first rule, I'm going to steal a phrase from another ecologist. And that first rule is really that some animals are more equal than others. And that ecologists, and one ecologist in particular, has dubbed these species keystone species that have a disproportionate effect on community diversity. And in the presence of the wildebeest, the Serengeti is a really different, richer, more diverse place than when they're reduced. That name keystone species comes not from work on the Serengeti, but from pioneering ecologist Bob Payne, who studied this on the rocky shores of the Pacific Ocean of northwestern Washington. Here's a picture of Bob removing a keystone species from that system, which is a starfish. That starfish is essentially the lion on the rocky shores of the intertidal region, because when that starfish is removed, the diversity of that whole community collapses down to as few as, for example, 1 species. Bob coined the term, this rather spastic animation on the right, keystone, after the last stone in a Roman arch, which is, of course, holding the 2 sides of the arch together. And when removed, the arch collapses. And when the keystone species is removed, as he experimentally demonstrated in the 1960s, diversity of the community collapses. So again, keystones are our first Serengeti rule, discovered somewhere else, but on display in the Serengeti. Bob also coined a term for this sort of domino effect that I described to you of how creatures in one level of the food chain influence creatures in other levels of the food chain. Those levels of the food chain are referred to as trophic levels in ecology terms, trophic referring to feeding. And we refer to this as a trophic cascade. And what's really important to hold on to, especially in understanding what's going on in the world, is that some species have a really strong indirect effect on others through these trophic cascades. Very quickly brings us to Serengeti rule number 2. That is about these strong indirect effects on other species through trophic cascades. So keystones and these strong indirect effects. Why are these important? Because they had to be figured out empirically. Observing ecosystems did not reveal how these things were working. These interactions are somewhat hidden until you understand through perturbations, either deliberately or accidentally for things like rinderpest, that these strong interactions are taking place. Now, you might be wondering while I was babbling about rules, what went on, what happened to the wildebeest, past 1977? Did they keep on growing? Well, if they did, really all of East Africa would be covered with wildebeest, 10 deep by now. So, no, in fact, they leveled off. And Tony was very interested, first of all, would the wildebeest level off, and at what level and why? It leveled off actually at about 1 million. So while that 1977 1.4 million figure was the peak year, and they kind of just meandered down a little bit to lower numbers, around about 1 million, where it's about where they stayed today. And the question is, what controls the number of wildebeest? What regulates the number of wildebeest? Now, formally speaking, you can imagine, if you think about it, it's a grazer. It can be regulated, for example, by predators that eat them, or it might be limited by food. And there's a shorthand that ecologists use to talk about these different modes of regulation, which is either referring to a food chain like this from the bottom up by the availability of food, or by the top down from predators. And before I tell you the answer for wildebeest, I want to tell you in general what regulates mammals in the Serengeti. Again, from long observations by Tony Sinclair and some of his collaborators like Justin Brashears and Simon Mduma. And this is one of my favorite things that I uncovered in trying to learn about the Serengeti and the actual literature. So, what regulates the wildebeest? Well, those mammals have the same possible modes of regulation as the wildebeest, which is they could be regulated from the top down or from the bottom up. And I want you to look at this graph. It's one of my favorite little graphs I've ever seen in the scientific literature, because if I had seen this going into the Serengeti, I would have had a better feel for what was going on. And look at the top left of the graph. As I said, I just don't have a pointer, so just go to the top left. And let's start with the oribi. All right, so charted along the bottom is animal body size in kilograms. Charted along the left is the percent of mortality by predation. So if you look at the oribi, a small mammal about 10 to 20 kilograms, look at that upper left figure. 100% death by predation, essentially, what they observed. Okay? That's because they're so small, there's about 10 different predators in the Serengeti that can take them down. Not just the cats, but jackals, large raptors, pythons, etc. I want you to just think for a moment. What do oribi parents tell their young about the future? Someday, Junior, you'll be... Okay, so that's life as an oribi, and you can see that Impala and Topi, while a little bit larger, pretty much largely controlled by predation. If you go to the right-hand part of the graph, you can see that the level of predation for elephants, hippos, rhinoceros, giraffe, essentially zero. Occasionally happens, maybe a youngster, but essentially zero. Well, look at their body size. Right? They're huge. They're very hard to take down. Their large body size means they've escaped predation pressure. And what you're looking at are really the two extremes of lifestyles in the Serengeti. And those of you who are old movie fans, I would point it this way, which is the upper left is sort of the James Dean live fast, die young lifestyle. Okay? Reproduce quickly or you're extinct. And this on the far right is kind of the Marlon Brando all-you-can-eat lifestyle, right? Which is just get as big as you can, and you won't be. Of course, these are huge food and water demands at this rate. So in a tough situation like drought, you're very vulnerable. Whereas oribi might be a little bit more nimble. So that's the general situation in the Serengeti. Where do the wildebeest fight? Well, the wildebeest are regulated by food. They're regulated from the bottom up. It took 40 years for Tony and Simon and Doom to figure this out. You might say, how does that work? How would you be regulated by sort of the amount of food? And somebody actually brought up sort of density, I think, a little earlier. So picture this. Picture the density of animals on the Serengeti and the amount of food available per capita. And what's going on as you look at this curve is because of rinderpest at the low end, wildebeest were at very low density. And when that pressure was relieved where they could, where they wouldn't die from the virus, their numbers just really took off. And that's because when food per capita is plentiful, the growth rate is high. Then as the Serengeti starts to fill up with wildebeest, well now growth declines, or actually population declines when food is limiting. And what happens is, especially in the dry season in the Serengeti, food is very limiting and you get a die-off of the wildebeest that ultimately caps their numbers. Now I tell you this just because all these food-limited animals essentially works the same way. Elephants, buffalo, etc. And this density-dependent regulation by food wasn't discovered in the Serengeti, it was discovered elsewhere. But again, it's seen in the Serengeti and across the world. Bring us to our third Serengeti rule. The regulation of some species depends upon their density. Give me 3 rules. Why did I tell you all these rules? And why did I show them to you in the Serengeti? And it really is, as we now appreciate through decades of study across the world by so many people, is that every place is a Serengeti. Every place where the basic food chain of plants that produce the food for the grazers, and the grazers, which are the food for the predators, everywhere where there's this sort of 3-level food chain, these Serengeti rules are in operation. And if that's true, if these rules are in operation everywhere, then it means to intervene in ecosystems, we got to know the rules. In the same way we got to know the rules in our own bodies. We need to understand the key players, the key species that regulate community structure. We need to figure out the rules that govern their play, the interactions with the other players. And we got to consider replacing what is missing or fixing broken links. So I want to close tonight with 2 examples of essentially this strategy in play in the world. And I'm going to start with what's called off in the American Serengeti, which is Yellowstone National Park, which I visited earlier in 2014. Now Yellowstone, if you've been there, it's a magnificent, inspiring place, but to an expert eye, digging a little deeper, there's some things going on in Yellowstone, certainly by the late 1990s, that were worrisome. And one of those things was evident in the population of aspen, the iconic tree of the American West. If you drill cores in these trees and look at the age of these trees, it turns out that most of the trees in Yellowstone are really old. There are relatively few young trees. So this is shown in this graph, where the trees really, after the age classes that are missing, really kind of start about the 1920s. So you see a lot of old trees from sort of the 1910s or so, and then where are all the new trees? Well, biologists studying this had some clues. Here's one of them. A ripple standing in the middle of an aspen grove, and if you look, he's got a pretty tall stick in his hand, and look at the trees behind him, and you see that black marks where all the bark is peeled off. Those are browsing marks. That's sort of a browsing line. And it looks like, when you see the aspen in this condition, that excessive elk browsing is going on. And of course, they're eating the young aspen that are easier to reach. Now the question would be, who's the culprit of this? Right? What's going on? Well, got to think a little bit about Yellowstone history. You got to think a little bit about the food chain in Yellowstone. So if there's a lot of elk browsing going on, and elk are eating the aspen, maybe there's something missing that should be eating the elk. I think you all could probably guess. Okay, maybe you heard this story before, but I'm still going to tell it. The reason I'm going to tell it is it's just such a simple illustration of these principles that I've been talking about. And so the story is that the last wolves were exterminated from Yellowstone in 1924. An uncanny coincidence with when aspen started showing a decline in new growth. So for this and other reasons, for about 20 years, fierce debate went on as to whether wolves should be reintroduced into Yellowstone to see what might happen. Now think about that. They've been missing for 70 years. Would biologists have any right to expect anything to happen in a system where something had been missing for so long? So in 1995, the first wolves were reintroduced back into Yellowstone, and biologists maintained their observations of animal populations and tree populations in Yellowstone. Let me give you a few of those observations over the subsequent 2 decades. But what happened was, after the reintroduction of the wolves, wolf populations oscillated within Yellowstone, but elk populations have decreased by about 2/3 net. It's a little more complicated. I'm not going to get into it today, but let's just say a lot of elk are being taken by predators. What else happened? Well, if you look at the aspen groves, you see a lot less browsing. You also see greater aspen heights over time. So those trees are responding. But perhaps to the surprise of many, if you look at other foliage, for example, willows, here's a picture on the left of before wolf reintroduction and after. See greater willow growth, willows along stream beds. Willows are the favorite food and building material of, humor me, there we go, beavers. And you see the beaver colonies flourishing again in parts of Yellowstone. It's also true that cottonwoods were doing better along stream banks, and they play an important role in sort of the stability of stream banks and the siltiness of the river. They also play a role in shading the river, which regulates temperature for fish populations. So there are these knock-on effects happening by the reintroduction of the top predator in Yellowstone. And that brings me to my 4th Serengeti rule, and it's really probably for the take-home message the most important for tonight. And that is, and I think it's given too little attention, that nature is resilient. After 70 years, the introduction of a pretty modest number of wolves had a dramatic effect on the Yellowstone system. And I'm going to give you some more evidence for the next statement. That given a chance, and that chance being habitat and protection and time, populations can rebound and rebound dramatically. I was telling you effects that were observable within 10 to 20 years. That's the other thing. We wouldn't know how long would it take if you did something like this. You know, is this 100 years? Is it 200 years? No, 10 to 20 years. Well, look at some other things that we've taken action on, just the protection of individual species, and the changes in numbers in a relatively modest period of time, sometimes from extreme lows. Northern elephant seals were almost hunted out to perhaps as few as 20 individuals by the end of the 19th century. Now number over 200,000. Sea otter down to perhaps as few as 1,000 individuals across the whole Pacific Rim. Now well over 100,000. You can see for Northern Pacific humpback whales, maybe a 12-fold recovery in 40 years. Bald eagles, fewer than 500 in the 1960s, now passing 10,000. Gray wolf, of course, was at 0 in Yellowstone until they were reintroduced. And of course, they've spread out across far beyond the park into the whole ecosystem. So this is just the rebound of individual species that are getting some protection. If the habitat is still there, they still sort of get the chance. And you've seen, for example, the impact of predators. But what about in situations when more than a single predator is missing, when you're talking about more than a single species? Can systems really come back? That's a key question. And you can imagine it's much harder to restore a whole system than one species. But that doesn't stop some extraordinary people from trying. So I'm going to close tonight with one story from another part of the world, which is the center of Mozambique in southeastern Africa. There is a national park there called Gorongosa. In the 1960s, it was a jewel known, for example, among the Hollywood jet set for its dense populations of elephant, buffalo, lion, in the center of the park, sort of easy to get to. And people went to Gorongosa to see that in the 1960s. And I got a little footage from that time. All right? This is September 1963, and you look at the safari vehicles going into Gorongosa and driving around and looking at all the populations. And the lions are so well fed, they're just sleeping next to the wildebeest. Okay? And the Gorongosa, the lion was the symbol of Gorongosa Park. And I'm using the past tense because after the liberation of Mozambique from Portugal, one of the worst civil wars in Africa broke out in the mid-1970s in Mozambique. More than 5 million people were displaced, 1 million people were killed, and unfortunately Gorongosa was the geographic center of sort of the rebel forces. And here's footage from Gorongosa during those times. It was the site of many, many battles. You may catch in one of this, in part of this footage, a picture of some of the park buildings. So needless to say, as this went on about 20 years, it was devastating for the wildlife. And tourism disappeared. Here's one of those park vehicles after the Civil War. Just shot to pieces, derelict. Sitting there. You can see that the park buildings behind are bombed out. Okay, and in terms of the wildlife, in the early 1970s, the wildlife was carefully censused, and when people were finally, after a truce, after cessation of hostilities, biologists went back in and counted the animals. Here's the before and after picture. The blue bars are before the Civil War in 1972. 14,000 buffalo reduced to about 50. 2,500 elephants, maybe 100 left. 3,000 hippo down to about 50. You can see the whole thing. Down to lions, where there were a few hundred, and they didn't see a single lion. In fact, they could drive through the park for hours on end and maybe see a single baboon or a single warthog. That's how things looked in the year 2000. And that's how they remain today, were it not for a single American philanthropist named Greg Carr. Greg had done well in the telecom industry in the 1990s, and he wanted to apply his interest in human development to somewhere in the world where he could bring his business skills and his resources to bear. And he learned about the plight of Mozambique, and he learned in particular about the plight of Gorongosa. And the Mozambique government invited him to Mozambique and said, well, anything you'd like to do, we'd love your help. And they were really having trouble recovering from more than 20 years of strife. And he said, well, let's restore Gorongosa. And the Mozambicans said, you're crazy. There's nothing left there. Despite that, in 2004, he signed a joint management agreement with the government of Mozambique to try to restore Gorongosa National Park. And he brought in teams of scientists and engineers and slept in the back of pickup trucks because there were no facilities left, contracted malaria 3 times, but stayed at it. opportunity to visit Gorongosa and have Greg show me around. So this is almost my last home video. But I'm just going to show you, Gorongosa is a very different landscape than the Serengeti I've been showing you. Its main feature is a lake at the center of the system that swells and shrinks. But it is a vast area with lots of different kinds of habitat around. And we're going to fly over. Whoa! Well, it's a home video and I can't stop the sound. There we go. And this is my handy-cam out of the helicopter window. So very authentic CBS News footage. And if you look around, so these are the little rivers that travel into this lake. And you can see some of the wildlife running around in the foreground. Fortunately, we're going to set this helicopter down so we're going to come over the lake here in a second. Pick up those dots in the foreground. Can you tell what they are? Hippos. It's good to be this far above hippos because, oh, thank you. But then is my volume going to be done? Can you hear me again? Yeah.
We can hear you.
You can hear me fine? Okay,
Yeah.
sorry about that. A little helicopter sound, why not? That's what it sounded like to me, hanging that camera outside. Okay, so we're going to set down the helicopter in a second and go somewhere else here. Waterhole. Look at this. Look at the number of youngsters in this park. Okay? So it just so happens while I was there, one of the smart things, great things that Greg Parr did was when he started this project, he invited in scientists from around the world to sort of help study what was going on, study individual species, understand how they might be managed, etc. And those scientists were conducting regular surveys of the animals. And I was there for when they reported the data in 2015 of the 2014 survey. So how have the large animal populations changed in Gorongosa over this time? Well, in 2000, that survey revealed fewer than 1,000 large mammals of all types. That's what you saw: buffalo, hippos, elephants, wildebeest, etc. The count in 2014, 71,000. Elephants were back into the 500 to 600, hippos were back into the 500 to 600. There are about 66 lions. Now, they're not all in the proportions they were prior to the Civil War. Different populations sort of were at different levels when sort of the pressure came off, and they're kind of racing each other in different ways. In fact, there's concern that there are not enough predators. 66 lions is not what it used to be. It's not enough to control the grizzly population. No other predators. There's no hyena. There's no wild dog. I would have said for the longest time there was no leopard. But last fall I got this picture in an email from Greg Parr. And this is the first leopard seen in Gorongosa in 40 years. Within the next few days, the whole family was seen of 3 more leopards. They're migrating in from other adjoining areas around Gorongosa. There's been enough time now and enough peace that the wildlife is moving around. So the predator profile is changing. Not only is the predator profile changing, but because in just 12 years, this place went from something that was viewed as hopeless, absolutely hopeless, to roaring back. And it's not just about the animals whatsoever. Carr is a very savvy and compassionate person, and he's built schools. The park provides the health care to the 200,000 people that live in the immediate development zone around the park. He employs hundreds of people from the local community in the park. There's community centers. He brings in thousands of kids from the local villages into the park who've never seen this wildlife in their lives. And the government of Mozambique is extremely enthusiastic. This has brought tremendous pride back to the Mozambicans. Stories about Gorongosa essentially air on TV every day. People know what's going on, and tourists are finally coming back. And tourists will be, of course, the key to economic prosperity in this area. So in just 12 years, the fate has changed so much that really the plan for Gorongosa has changed. And I call it Serengeti 2 because this is just a sketch. You can see, if you can see on the left side of the shaded green area, the outlines of Gorongosa National Park. All that stuff to the right is proposed to become part of a larger conservation area. Mixed use, there'll be 200,000 people living in this region. But that's also true of the extended Serengeti conservation area. And by the addition, the annexing of these other areas, The park will extend to the Indian Ocean and to the Zambezi River, and that will expand it about 8-fold for conservation purposes. The area is really important to the biodiversity that it can hold. That resulting 30,000 square kilometer area is comparable to the entire Serengeti conservation area, including Ngorongoro Crater, etc. So in 2017, one of the poorest countries in the world is dead serious about forming a conservation area that's as large as any in East Africa. I also have to tell you the cost of this project. You can take some guesses if you want. How much does it cost to bring back a place like this, provide health care to 200,000 people, build schools, community centers, employ several hundreds, et cetera, et cetera? You want to take a guess?
$7 billion.
7 billion. That's the first guess. So if I told you $6 million, would you be impressed? How can we afford not to do this? I had no idea what it would cost to do this. $6 million. $6 million with what we spent. Never mind. I'm not going to sermon. All right. I just say that in awe of Greg Carr, who's one of the most inspiring individuals I've ever met in my life. I've never seen a combination of humility and effectiveness in a human like Greg Carr. And we think the potential carrying capacity for the expanded area will be about 10,000 elephants and about 500 lions. That's the plan, that's the public plan of the Mozambican government. The president of Mozambique has been here in the United States, received conservation awards, etc. This is the commitment of the Mozambican people because they know that certainly for the hundreds of thousands of people in the immediate area, this is a path to greater quality of life. Now, what about Serengeti? Well, I'm happy to report that from really, I think, reliable sources, that the only roads to the Serengeti remain unpaved. And let's certainly hope it stays that way. Thanks for listening. Noise levels on that.
That was great. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then we will have a lot more opportunity for conversation. Any questions?
Right there.
Yeah, I wanted to ask sort of almost a philosophical question about how we, as science, evaluate alternative hypotheses and rules. So I was at a symposium in August at the July Society American on Yellowstone wolf reproduction. And as I'm sure you know, there's plenty of evidence for the wolves causing these cascades. But there's another group that has pretty compelling evidence that there's alternative explanations.
Right.
Changes in climate, changes in hydrology, changes by the beavers. It's really actually pretty interesting to see how each camp had their own set of hypotheses. So situations like this where we, it's not like we can take 3 classes in the lab and do a reading experiment and find out in 3 weeks and do those experiments. So how do we evaluate these alternatives?
Well, I think we evaluate so the question was, there's been a lot of further study of the Yellowstone system, and there's really good scientific work that shows that there's more complexity to the story than what I just told you. And you talk about, given that you can't run controls in this situation in the same way you would in a laboratory, how do we evaluate competing or perhaps some incompatible claims about interpretation of what's going on. But let me tell you, because I've talked to the camps as well. So what I told you is true from an observation. The question is, what's the cause and effect? So these things happen. Well, other things have been going on. So for example, the bears have been grabbing a lot of elk calves. And some of the elk mortality is certainly due to bears. And some of that bear activity, as I understand, may also be due to what's happening to their other food sources. There's also bears following the wolves around, and once the wolves make a kill, the bears chase them off and take the meal. There's also impacts on migration patterns of the elk, and that impacts our concerns about hunting guides' livelihoods and hunting livelihoods and things like this. There's a common phrase essentially saying that wolves have changed the course of rivers, but they can't change them back to the way they were. It's kind of an overstated claim because some of those changes in hydrology are essentially permanent. There are some effects on silting and on the stability of riverbanks, but the changes that happened in the 70 years previous to Yellowstone don't look to be very reversible. And some of the changes may actually be due to beaver activity, as you're pointing out. So the point is to say that obviously with so many moving parts in a system, things are complicated. I think that you say a philosophical point on how to evaluate. I think you just evaluate it by you keep studying and you keep testing hypotheses the best way you can. Some of the claims that have been made have been, are being, further scrutinized. I think there's a worry as these scientific discussions go public, as they did, I think, in the press around 2014 or so, that, quote, the Yellowstone story is, and so the pendulum can swing the other way, and you can overstate the criticism, because the phenomena of what happened are the phenomena of what happened. What we're really trying to tease apart is cause and effect. What are direct effects? What are indirect effects? What other sort of things happen that we didn't fully understand? So there's a risk, particularly because Yellowstone's been under a political microscope. The fate of the wolf has been really under political battles. That I think there's a big risk that in certain spheres, as is happening in other aspects of environmental discussions, that the whole baby gets thrown out with the bathwater, right? Which is that's not scientifically valid either, right? So it's tricky for scientists to sort out these highly visible, large-scale things where the public has eyes on them, et cetera. As we sort it out through our processes, we don't necessarily control where others take that view. So I think we do science the way we do science: peer review, data, hypothesis testing, debate, discussion, et cetera. We just know that there's some high stakes here, because naysayers, certain forces are going to cherry pick an argument and use that to clear the slate. And for example, the wolf is back under or losing its protection, right? So is that fair enough? You think it's I'm not a working ecologist. I only sometimes play one on TV. Yeah, right here.
I was just wondering, you were talking about like microbiology and also like ecology, which is more of like a larger scale. I was just wondering, we have technologies like CRISPR-Cas, like at a microbiological level, that like help specificity. You know what I mean? You can like pinpoint things and cure diseases and understand things. Do you think that technology could become more of a macrobiology type of thing?
So the question is, do the technologies that really come from the molecular scale, from molecular and microbiology, can that help studying things on a larger scale? What popped into my mind were some certain examples. And of ecologists I know who are, these are tools, right? You're saying, what can certain technology, informatic tools start to become really important. Large data set, sort of gathering tools become really important when you have a lot of moving parts, when you want to have a lot of data sets, et cetera. But I can even tell you things like DNA. If you're asking, for example, I was actually on a field exercise in Gorongosa to see this, which is, what are these animals eating? You want to know, for example, what's in their diet, say of the grazers. And you can learn some interesting things, but it's really hard to learn with binoculars from a proper distance what they're eating. But as it turns out, there's other ways to sample what they're eating. Use your imagination. And it turns out you can DNA type essentially all the plant matter that's in the droppings and understand something about diet that's very hard to tell from observation. And essentially DNA barcoding of droppings can do that. I tease the ecologist is doing this. Usually in my lab, they take pure DNA and turn it to shit. But yeah, right there. Yeah, right there.
How are they handling the poultry problem?
Poaching, great. Thank you for that question. So one of the words I say in resilience is protection. So the combination of civil war and no protection whatsoever, look, people there are in dire straits, and that's meat, okay? So there's a ranger force of about 120 in Gorongosa. There are snares everywhere. For example, most of the lions have encountered a snare and show some kind of damage. In fact, a lot of them are collared, maybe they're all collared. And basically the rangers have to race out and get them out of these snares. They're clearing snares all day long, every day, 7 days a week. Now, elephant poaching's not been an issue. They've only lost 1 or 2 elephants in the last 15 years or so. I'll give you a little aside as to why that may be true. It's because those elephants in Gorongosa have long memories. And they scare the hell out of me and others. They don't like people being around. And well, I'm just going to tell you this, because if you start saying, oh, I want to go to Gorongosa because Carol said, you know, tourism there is, etc. Watch out for the elephants. I know of multiple vehicle rammings by elephants in Gorongosa. So the older elephants, having been through the trauma they had, they are agitated by human presence. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that because of what happened during the war, about 70% of the elephants in Gorongosa are tuskless. There's always a frequency of tusklessness in elephants. Well, if you take all the ones with tusks for ivory and cull them, and then from that small tuskless population they start to rebound, you have a big population of tuskless elephants. So the combination of being very dangerous and tuskless makes them not much of a target for poachers. Other things though, I was there for about 9 days. Casually, I saw 3 pickup loads of poachers being brought into the law enforcement part of Gorongosa Park. So they know that they have to keep this up. And in fact, as the place becomes more successful, as this, I call it the salad bowl, because all this greenery with this wetness, as that salad bowl fills up with animals, that's just a huge target, right? So that pressure will never go away. You know, they're trying to manage it. And they got to be really careful, because when they catch somebody having, you know, shot, you know, an antelope or something like that, they can't jail that person for 6 months. That's the sole provider for that family. That's not going to work with good community relations. You know, these families are living on barely anything. So they have to sort of rehabilitate and re-educate and hope that the poaching, you know, does not, that an individual poacher does not stay at it. Very, very tricky community relations, but the park, I should tell you, it's managed by Mozambicans. It's the main warden is Mozambique, the head of law enforcement is Mozambican, etc. It's quite a social, you know, experiment as well. Because that long history of the Portuguese, you know, there's not a lot of enthusiasm for whites and Europeans in, you know, in positions of authority there. They loved Greg Carr, but that was a hard-earned love. Maybe 1 or 2 more, you guys think? Far right? Yeah.
There's a lot of controversy surrounding big game hunting, accessible land.
Yeah.
What would your thoughts be on the assertion that it actually serves a constructive purpose in conservation?
Could you restate?
Yeah, sorry. The question was, there's been a lot of controversy about big game hunting, like the killing of Cecil the lion, and the argument that it serves a purpose in big game conservation because it's a source of revenue. I think it's kind of a simple choice, which is, you know, the amount of money it's generating in Western terms is, you know, paltry. In African terms, and if the money's staying anywhere near the park, you know, it's significant. If it's $50,000 for a license or something like that, that's a significant amount of money. But it seems kind of ridiculous, you know, to be dependent upon that as a resource. And look, I'm not like anti-hunting, and in fact, you know, go shoot all the deer you want. You know, that's what you get with no wolves. But it does seem as, so for example, I'll pick up the lions for a second. So the lion population in Africa may have been as large as at least probably 200,000, may have been 400,000 50 years ago. We're down to about 23,000. Okay? So the amount of habitat for lion has shrunk. Serengeti is one of the last strongholds, 4,000 lions in the Serengeti ecosystem. So, you know, I don't know if we can keep playing that game much longer. Is kind of my feeling. I think it's too pat an explanation. It just seems that the amount of resources that it takes to protect what's left is so minuscule in Western terms that, you know, the world should help more. Any more? One more? Yeah.
So how does the one guy kill the starfish in an area? Like, how do you clear away?
How do you clear away all the starfish? Glad you asked about the Bob Payne experiment. And in detail, you can see it in a little film that we produced with Bob Payne in 2016 called Keystone Species and Trophic Cascades. About a 15-minute long film. You're looking at me like, yeah, I'm running right home to watch it. But anyway, so what Bob did is he found this sort of platform where what happens is they'll be down, okay, with the tides. And at sort of the base of the mussel beds, there are all these big ochre starfish. And what Bob did was, using all of his 6'6" frame, is he would sneak up on the starfish with a pry bar gently, because you don't want to tear their arms off. Take those on one stretch of rock, take the starfish off, and pitch him as far as he could throw him out of the water. And leave another patch unmanipulated. And come back every month and repeat that. And he saw within months that the barnacle populations and the mussel populations were changing. And over years, what happened was the mussels took over the whole rock face, and all sorts of things, chitons, snails, algae, all disappeared. It just became a monoculture of mussels. Now those starfish preyed on the mussels, so without the predator there to sort of keep that population in check, that population just took over. And the control was an adjacent set of rock where they didn't do it. One of the classic experiments, I mean, this is talking about high tech. There must be a number of ecologists in the audience. Hands up. Oh my God. If I'd known that, I never would have showed up. You know, I mean, one of the beautiful things, and I fortunately got to meet Bob only months before he passed away, that, you know, one of the simplest and yet, you know, most influential experiments in ecology. Remove the predator, see what happens in the community, run the control on an adjacent spot. So that's it. And with that, he's a legend. So.
Thank you, Dr. Carroll, for a wonderful and inspiring talk that we can all make a difference, even if we're a starfish or a wolf or something like this. I also want to explicitly thank Don Kohler and Julie Robinson. Anything that goes smoothly tonight is thanks to the immense preparation of those two and in making all of this function. I encourage everybody to step over to the museum, at least for a second, grab a fun snack for the road, stay for a while if you have an opportunity to talk, and we hope to see you again.
Tidal area where the water's going up and down, okay, with the tides. And at sort of the base of the mussel beds, there are all these big ochre starfish. And what Bob did was, using all of his 6'6" frame, is he would sneak up on the starfish with a pry bar gently, because you don't want to tear their arms off. Take those on one stretch of rock, take the starfish off, and pitch him as far as he could throw him out of the water. And leave another patch unmanipulated. And come back every month and repeat that. And he saw within months that the barnacle populations and the mussel populations were changing. And over years, what happened was the mussels took over the whole rock face, and all sorts of things, chitons, snails, algae, all disappeared. It just became a monoculture of mussels. Now those starfish preyed on the mussels, so without the predator there to sort of keep that population in check, that population just took over. And the control was an adjacent set of rock where they didn't do it. One of the classic experiments, I mean, this is talking about high tech. There must be a number of ecologists in the audience. Hands up. Oh my God. If I'd known that, I never would have showed up. You know, I mean, one of the beautiful things, and I fortunately got to meet Bob only months before he passed away, that, you know, one of the simplest and yet, you know, most influential experiments in ecology. Remove the predator, see what happens in the community, run the control on an adjacent spot. So that's it. And with that, he's a legend. So.
Thank you, Dr. Carroll, for a wonderful and inspiring talk that we can all make a difference, even if we're a starfish or a wolf or something like this. I also want to explicitly thank Don Kohler and Julie Robinson. Anything that goes smoothly tonight is thanks to the immense preparation of those two and in making all of this function. I encourage everybody to step over to the museum, at least for a second, grab a fun snack for the road, stay for a while if you have an opportunity to talk, and we hope to see you again.